While schools and universities boast urban legends alongside ghosts, prisons tend to be a bit more like hospitals, because you'll find tales of hauntings but little in the way of folklore. It's probably due to the concentration of human life in one place and the brutality that runs alongside it. Somehow, haunted prisons don't seem so surprising. But that's not to say they're the only tales about prisons, because according to the Illustrated London News, a specific will-o'-the-wisp haunts prisons, and any prisoner that sees the wisp will come to a violent death. Yet we're concerned here with prisons. Now, due to the matters of time, our main focus is on just 3 prisons. Joliet Prison in Illinois, Shepton Mallet in Somerset, and Barlinnie Prison in Lanarkshire. Obviously, you can find out more about Belfast's Crumlin Road Jail in the Belfast episode. So let's have a look at these tales of haunted prisons in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. We are switching gears from haunted hospitals last week to haunted prisons this week, and just as a reminder, we will be doing library folklore next week, so that should be fun as well. And as ever, there is a little bit of a content warning at the beginning, because obviously, again, we're looking at tales of hauntings and we're looking at them in prisons. So the tales do have some discussion of death and violence in some of them due to the subject matter. So if that is going to be difficult for you, then please do feel free to skip this week and come back for libraries next week and take care of yourself if you need to. But otherwise, we're going to just jump straight in, and we're going to start off with an American one. And I know I don't always include American folklore, and in some cases that's because there's other podcasts that just do it better. And in some cases, I do prefer to go to places that I've actually been. And obviously, I haven't actually been to any of these prisons. And the only prisons I have been to have been ones like Newcastle Castle that was once used as a prison and stuff like that. So I felt that with this one, I just wanted interesting stories. And again, as I did with the hospitals one, rather than looking at the more sensationalised stuff online, I actually went to British newspaper archives, and this first story of Joliet Prison, and I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that right because I've never actually heard it said, but it was originally discussed in an issue of the Spiritualist newspaper, and it was all about the story of a haunted cell. Now, Joliet Prison is in Illinois, and the prison dates back to 1858, and it's a really weird setup of the way it was originally built, because 53 prisoners arrived, there was already a small building on site, and they then had to build the prison themselves, which is a really bizarre situation to find yourself in. But by 1878, the prison was already over capacity, unsanitary and dangerous, and that's within just 20 years of it being built. And it's from these conditions that the ghost stories were reported by the Spiritualist newspaper. And apparently a prisoner named Chase, don't know if that's first or surname, that was just what was given in the article, once occupied the cell, which explained its frequency as a site of phenomena in the reports. Now, one prisoner who occupied the cell reported seeing Chase several times, and then one of his sightings actually involved a headless ghost. So quite how we knew it was Chase, I'm not sure, but there we go. And on another occasion, and I quote, his head seemed to be opened and the brains taken out, end quote, which actually does reference the experiments done on Chase's skull following his execution. So he did have various things done to him, supposedly in the name of science. And the prisoner also reported that he appeared between 10:50 p.m. and 3 a.m. And what was really interesting about this is I have no idea if the prisoners actually knew what happened to Chase after he was executed for them to be so specific about seeing things like portions of his skull being missing, because other prisoners actually corroborated those reports. They mentioned that they'd seen marks on his neck and things like that when the phantom appeared. Now, apparently, the favourite trick of the ghost was basically climbing into the bunk, sometimes described as a hammock, nearest the wall, and then essentially pushing the prisoner back out of it so Chase could have the bed to himself. Some prisoners reported feeling cold and clammy hands on them, but they also felt paralysed and unable to move. And some of them described this kind of sensation where they could see the ghost, but they couldn't actually take their eyes off him. It was almost like they were compelled to look at him. And people at the prison noted that prisoners often refused to sleep in the cell after their first night there. And what's really interesting is that many of these prisoners actually knew nothing of the ghost prior to their stay in his cell, which obviously it was really interesting that the Spiritualist magazine picked up on that. Now, surprisingly, some of the prisoners actually refused to speak to the members of the press because, and I quote, they became so disgusted with the way they, as in the press, magnify and distort the truth, end quote. And the prisoners were basically so convinced that their experiences were real that they refused to see these experiences turned into ridicule and senseless sensation by reporters. And I think we can all think of newspapers that would do that now. Now, we do obviously have to be mindful that the Spiritualist newspaper did have its own agenda in reporting the story, but their inherent belief in the supernatural did mean that their report isn't filled with the ridicule that the prisoners feared from other newspapers. It's actually quite a matter-of-fact report, to be honest with you, and it does directly quote the prisoners quite a lot, so it kind of provides their testimony as evidence rather than something to ridicule them for. So I think it was a really interesting source to find. Now, the prison essentially continued its decline and another state prison was built as well. And the prison also has appeared in various films. It's in the Blues Brothers and stuff like that. And it actually closed for good in 2002. And as abandoned buildings generally do, it began to rot. There was arson there, people broke in, all that kinds of thing. Now, they actually started running tours of the prison in 2018 and Ghost Adventures investigated, and I'm saying that in air quotes, the prison in 2019, ostensibly to contact the spirit of former inmate John Wayne Gacy, the rather notorious serial killer. I'm not going to bother coming out with any comments about what I think of Ghost Adventures, but I think the very idea that you would go to a prison and immediately try to speak to one of its more infamous inmates kind of makes me wonder what your agenda is. But anyway, in 2023, as in this year, but obviously in case you're listening to this next year, the prison continued to host its haunted house entertainment experience in the building. And they essentially have you going into different rooms and like people in fancy dress and whatnot are milling around and all that kind of thing. It sounds an awful lot like the Chamber of Horrors live at Madame Tussauds in London, if you've been to that. And according to some websites, Joliet is one of the most haunted places on earth, but the same websites kind of provide little evidence to back up the claim, whereas at least this article from 1874 from the Spiritualist does at least provide a few more specifics. Now, I bring up the idea of something being a most haunted place or a most haunted prison because Shepton Mallet Prison in Somerset also lays claim to being the world's most haunted jail on the homepage of its website, which is quite a big claim to make, and I'm not entirely sure how you would ever be able to prove or disprove that particular title. But anyway, C Wing, once home to its female prisoners, is apparently one of the more haunted parts of the prison. Now, by comparison to Joliet Prison, Shepton Mallet openly advertises its ghost tour as avoiding gimmicks, focusing on the stories of the jail rather than the entertainment. So you're essentially doing more a history tour that happens to include stories of ghosts, which kind of feels like a much less sensational way of doing it. Now, the prison does have a lengthy lifespan from which to draw its spectral occupants because it actually opened in 1625 and closed in 2013. So there's a lot of life and death has happened in this particular building. And long-term listeners will know my fascination for white lady ghosts or green ladies or grey ladies or pink ladies even. And Shepton Mallet Prison apparently has one. And according to the legend, she wafts through the prison and leaves both intense cold and the smell of perfume in her wake. Now, according to the prison's website, the story dates to the 1970s, when prisoners kept requesting extra bedding due to the cold, and people apparently reported smelling perfume in the prison. Officers hated working the night shift, and prisoners grew uncomfortable in their cells. And the prison actually asked the Home Office to investigate. So you kind of feel like, imagine the kind of people who are having to stay in a prison and who are also working in one and actually being so freaked out that they're asking the Home Office to investigate. You sort of feel like there must have been substantial stuff going on. Now, the Home Office did investigate for 3 days and found little conclusive evidence, and I'm not going to pass any comments about that whatsoever, but I'm sure my tone speaks volumes. Now, I did find a story about the White Lady in a newspaper from 1967. It claimed that she was beheaded in 1680, And the prison governor at the time in 1967, Barry Wigington, actually claimed that the disturbances occurred in June and July 1966, although they did stop apparently of their own accord and nobody could actually ascertain what caused them. Now, Wigington even investigated himself, and I love the fact that the newspaper feels the need to tell us that he was 6'3" and burly, as if that kind of makes any difference whatsoever. But anyway, Wigington did spend a night in the duty room where staff reported a weird presence. Now, 2 prison chaplains also discounted the stories after investigating, and to be honest, Wigington was like, do you know what, I can't actually tell what's going on, it's all fine. And so he, as far as anyone can tell, thought that the stories were utter bunkum. Now, despite all of this, warders continue to consider the prison haunted. They reported, and I quote, unaccountable bangings, the sound of heavy breathing, and the feeling that something or somebody is present in the room while they are on duty, end quote. And if you've ever been around anything paranormal or supernatural, there are usually explanations for quite a lot of these things. Infrasound is a one that gets thrown around quite a lot, and there are obviously other things that would kind of present these sort of symptoms, as it were, as well. Obviously, ghosts is one of them, but it would be interesting for somebody with more modern equipment to have been able to have a look at this. But anyway, I'm wandering off on a tangent, because one warder was so freaked out that he actually said he wouldn't spend another night in the duty room even for £1,000. So you kind of think, again, my God, what on earth must have been happening for these people to feel this way? And according to the prison website, over time, staff on duty at night began seeing white figures and shadows on the stairs. Now, the website is incredibly vague about the backstory, and they said that they discovered the story of the White Lady after some research, and they don't give you a name or a date, which you would think some research would tell you. But a woman apparently murdered her husband and was sentenced to execution, and the website said she would be hanged in the town centre. So if this is the case, then the story must have occurred before 1868, because that's when public executions were banned. So that can at least give us a time after which it wouldn't have happened. It does also contradict the 1967 newspaper article that the woman was beheaded, but to be completely honest with you, a hanging would have been much more likely as a method of execution anyway. But in this particular story that the prison website gives, the night before the execution, the officers offered her a final request. She asked for her wedding dress. Now, bit of an odd request, but probably not the weirdest thing I think they've ever been asked for, so they complied. And then the following morning, when they opened her cell, they found her dead, still wearing the wedding dress. They obviously wanted to search for evidence of wrongdoing to find out what had actually happened to her, but they found none. And I quote, and it was concluded that she must have died of a broken heart, end quote. This story therefore does seem to ignore the fact that she apparently murdered her husband, so I'm not quite sure why she had a broken heart, but there we go. But now she apparently wanders the prison. Although I do think it's quite interesting that the 1967 article refers to banging and feelings of unease, but there's no mention of ghostly perfume, so I would love to read whichever articles mention that. But that's basically, the White Lady seems to be one of their more famous inmates. Now, other inmates of the prison did include the Cray twins at one point, but people have apparently heard the ghostly cries of female prisoners as well. Now, it's not just the White Lady that haunts Shepton Mallet, however, and a 1984 article in the Daily Mirror, so again, it's the Daily Mirror, but I did find stuff that was similar elsewhere, reported that prisoners claimed to be haunted by a figure in a World War II uniform, and according to them, the figure was floating in and out of the prison library. Now, what's interesting is the gallows actually stood on the site before the jail, and this was actually used by the Americans during the Second World War. And according to records, 16 American soldiers were hanged and 2 met their end by firing squad. Now, apparently, conditions at the prison at the time when the Americans had it was so horrific that a prisoner wrote to his parents and described it as, and I quote, "worse than ever I imagine hell to be," end quote. It is worth bearing a few historical contextual things in mind here, because politicians apparently raised matters with President Eisenhower and also asked questions in Parliament once they discovered that over 70% of the executions involved black prisoners, so there is that element to bear in mind as well. But as politicians are wont to do, they did discuss this, but they didn't actually do anything to stop it. But prisoners in 1984 actually believed the ghost to be one of the servicemen who had been hanged on death row. And what was really interesting is when they were asked, the Home Office actually confirmed that the library did stand on the gallows site, but they also said, and I quote, "we do not intend to do anything about it," end quote. No change there then. So we do have to wonder exactly what the Home Office made of these 2 different reports of hauntings at Shepton Mallet Prison. Now, the third prison is Barlinnie Prison in Glasgow. And in 1969, 3 prisoners claimed that their cell was haunted. And what makes this one really unusual and what caught my eye is the fact that they were actually in the cell before the haunting started. So it's not like in Joliet Prison where prisoners were being moved into the haunted cell. This was the fact that a ghost seemed to move in with them, which is really interesting. Now, according to the timeline presented in the story, the ghost only turned up on Friday, 15th of August 1969. And it began throwing things around in the cell, starting with a mirror. And it seemed that the mirror just falling off the wall didn't really bother them that much, and it was only when mugs started throwing themselves from a shelf that they started to get freaked out by it. A prisoner who was released on Monday the 18th of August confirmed the story, saying all 3 cellmates insisted that the ghost was real, and one of them even requested a move to another cell. An official spokesman at the Scottish Home and Health Department declined to comment, saying they did not, and I quote, comment on matters of internal administration, end quote. Now, it's not the only tale of haunting associated with the prison, because other people have reported seeing a Victorian woman with a lantern, and she apparently loiters in the area outside the surgery wing and the entrance to the execution space. But this particular story that I was really interested in was the one with the prisoners actually saying, look, our cell is haunted. And it was the stories of these 3 prisons that kind of made me start to reevaluate some of these stories. Because I'll be honest, when I first started researching the episode, I was like, oh, isn't it fascinating how many prisons that are now museums claim to be haunted, and oh, they coincidentally run ghost tours. And I'll be honest, I mean, I've been to Jedburgh Castle Jail in the Borders, and I did a paranormal investigation there, and the team I was in, absolutely nothing happened. But it's, again, touted as being this really hugely haunted space. So I was kind of like, yeah, I suppose it's a good way to get people in. However, once I started researching the stories and looking at the newspaper articles, it did become apparent that staff and inmates were reporting stories of hauntings in earlier times. And for these to even be as relatively recent as 1984 was, I think, actually quite interesting. Because I think in some ways, some of the stories feel a bit more solid. So the Joliet Prison one, for example, for me, because it includes a named prisoner believed to be responsible and elements of what happened to him that new prisoners couldn't possibly have known, it does tie the story into the lifespan of the jail. And I think the investigations that were then launched into Tales of Haunting, particularly by the Home Office, do help to back up the fact that people believed there was a ghost, at least in order to report the story. Although I must admit, the White Lady, while she does sound plausible, I kind of would have preferred to have a name and a year, although you might get that if you go on the tour, I don't know. And we do need to bear in mind the fact that the tales might be invented by bored prisoners, and difficult conditions working in such an environment might prompt officers and warders to feel uneasy, especially at night, particularly when we also consider things like the construction materials of prisons and the way that they're actually built as well, like the panopticon idea where they're designed so that people feel like they're under surveillance all of the time. That is going to play tricks on you because that is the point. However, ghost stories also don't seem like the kind of thing that you'd either A, claim you were a victim of, or B, just buy into in general if you wanted to maintain a particular kind of reputation. So I am a little bit more inclined to go, these warders aren't particularly the kind of people that I imagine would be susceptible to stuff very easily. So it does make you start to wonder. And I do think it's entirely likely that prisons would be haunted for the same reason that a lot of other buildings are, because they contain a wealth of human activity and they're also often a site of death as well. So if ghosts really do linger where a person met their end, then it does stand to reason that inmates would remain. I really would be fascinated to actually visit the Shepton Mallet one, just to kind of get a sense of what the space is actually like. And I think that's the thing that got me with the Joliet one. It was the idea of turning it into these like haunted house experiences. That does make me a little bit uneasy, because you think there's one thing visiting these spaces to understand the history of an area, the history of prisons, the history of like the penal system and so on. That's one thing. But I think doing it for entertainment purposes in a place where executions were carried out, I do find that a little bit weird. So if you have done one of these haunted house experiences, obviously please do feel free to let me know what they're like. And again, if you have gone on the tour at Shepton Mallet and anything weird's happened, please let me know. But as I say, I'm a little bit sceptical about sort of making them these sites of mass spectacle considering what happened in them. But that might just be me. Like I say, next week we're going to go on to libraries, which is like the complete other end of the spectrum in a lot of ways. And I am going to actually be doing the museums, folklore and ghost stories episode as a bonus for Patreon supporters. So if you would like to hear that, then please do feel free to sign up at the $3.50 a month or more tier, and you'll get all the goodness. And there's like 47, I think, bonus episodes now. There's a lot of extra content for you to plough through if you do become a Patreon supporter. So you are welcome as part of the Fabulous Folklore family. But anyway, I'll let you crack on with whatever it was that you were doing before you started listening to this, and I'll see you next week when we have a look at the folklore of libraries. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.